Hey, good morning, Cobb Prairie. This is Pastor Chris, and I want to welcome you guys to our online service. We are so excited to have you joining us today. Now, before I dive into the message, I want to give you a quick reminder. If you plan on coming to our Christmas Eve services, we hold them at the Kill Creek Barn in DeSoto. We have several services throughout the day. We have 1, 3, 5, 7, and 11. But due to the fire code, there's limited room in the barn. And so if you could let us know you're coming by going to backtothebarn.info or checking out the link in the notes tab, you can reserve your seats there. And we just want to make sure that we have room for everybody at all the services. So you doing that is a huge help. So thank you. But today we're going to be finishing up our series entitled Back to the Beginning. And the idea behind this series was that Pastor Dan and I, we were going to take a look at the first chapter of each of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and ask the question, why did that Gospel writer begin his story, the story of Jesus, the way that he did? And of course, this was somewhat motivated by Christmas because two of those chapter ones, Matthew and Luke, deal directly with the Christmas story. Those are the ones that we read when we gather around the Christmas tree and talk about Jesus. Now, somehow I got stuck with the other two, Mark and John. Mark, not at all. He jumps right into Jesus' story. Jesus is like 30 years old when Mark begins. But John is kind of in between. He doesn't include the traditional Christmas story, but he includes it in a more, we'll just say unique way. And so that's the one that we're going to be diving into today. We're going to be diving into the first chapter of the book of John. Now, as I'm getting into those, I want to talk a little bit about the Gospels and the timing and the purpose of each of them, because I think if we know that, it can help us kind of understand what John is doing here. Now, even though they're in our Bible as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's not actually the order that they were written. The first to be written was Mark. It was very early on. And then a little bit later, around the same time, Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels. And there's evidence that they actually had a copy of Mark's and they were using it kind of as a template. They were building onto it. And then quite a bit later, we get John. And John goes kind of a completely different direction with it. In fact, those first three are sometimes called the synoptic Gospels because they flow together so well. And then John is kind of this one-off, unique one at the end there. And I think each of the writers, because of when they were writing, were attempting to answer a different question. Mark is answering the question, what happened? If you read his gospel, it's super fast-paced because he's telling you one story and another story and another story. It almost sounds like somebody testifying in a court of law. They're just trying to get the facts down. Now, by the time Matthew and Luke write their gospels, they're trying to answer the question, why did it happen? They're trying to put some context to the stories. Why did Jesus say that? Why did Jesus do that? And so they're trying to give us a fuller picture of it. But by the time we get to John, John is trying to answer the question, what does it mean? He's less concerned with the facts and more concerned with the effect that these stories have on our lives. He wants to know, what does it mean that Jesus said this? What does it mean that Jesus did that? How does that apply to us? And that's why you see him write in a completely different order than the other Gospels and dive into more theological concepts. He even gets poetic, which is what we're going to experience today. And I think John, writing the way he did, was spurred on by a bit of a challenge that he had. A big shift had happened in between the writing of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John. And the shift was this, that during the first three Gospels, like while they were being written, the Christian faith was still very much rooted in the Jewish faith. The people that were converting to Christianity were coming out of Judaism. And so when they would talk about Jesus, when they would approach these individuals, they knew kind of that there was this common background of the Jewish faith. And one of the things that the Jewish faith held very strongly to was this idea of a Messiah, that someday someone was going to come and save them. And so when they went out to share about Jesus, it was a really easy transition for them. They could be like, hey, well, you're looking for a Messiah? Well, we've got a Messiah. His name is Jesus. And that began that conversation. But by the time that John wrote his gospel, the faith had spread. It had spread outside of Israel, outside of Palestine, and to a broad range of places like Greece and Rome. And as it spread, more people became Christians outside of the Jewish faith than inside of the Jewish faith. And so as John writes, he's writing to a different audience. And he's got this challenge because that audience doesn't have that same background that they did before. They don't have this shared understanding of Messiah. And so when John goes to write, he's got to figure out, how am I going to convey this idea of Jesus to a people that aren't expecting a Messiah? What language do I use to convey that, to begin that conversation? So John had to come up with a creative way to introduce the idea of Jesus to this new audience without losing the old audience. And this is where the brilliance comes in. John chooses to use a word that is going to have meaning to both of those readers, that has a deep tradition in both the Jewish tradition and the Greek tradition. And that word that he chose to use is logos, which translates literally to word. And you're going to see him use that frequently as he begins this chapter. But I want to set up a little bit of the background of how each of those two audiences would have understood that word coming into this. To the Jewish tradition, the word was something that God used to create, to move, to change. His word carried power. In fact, there's a bunch of passages you can look up in the Old Testament, but here's a great example in Psalm 33, verse 6. It said, "The Lord merely spoke and the heavens were created. He breathed the word and the stars were born." His word had that much power. And they believed that because God's word was so powerful, our words could also be powerful. That's why in the New Testament, the disciples, Jesus talks to them about blessing and cursing and how our words have power over people. And if you think about history, so many of the great movements have a great speech attached to them. I have a dream. And you can see how those words inspired creating, moving, and changing. And so to the Jewish audience, word meant power. It meant God doing something. Now, to the Greek audience, they also had a tradition of using this concept of word, and it goes back long before Jesus. In 560 BC, there was a Greek philosopher who actually lived in the same area that John is when he wrote his gospel, the Gospel of John. But he had this idea that the world was constantly changing. It was in flux. He used this image that you can never step into a river in the same place more than once, because the river is always moving and changing, and the world is the same way. But then he believed that this idea of the word, it brought order and structure to everything. He concluded kind of this idea that all the change and flux is not haphazard. It is controlled and ordered, following a continuous pattern all the time, and that which controlled the pattern was the logos, the word, the reason of God. I see that word logos can also be translated reason. It can be word or reason. And they believed in both of those meanings kind of put together. That's what God was using to create structure in the chaos. And so the Greek, they knew all about logos. They saw in logos the creating and guiding and directional power of God, the power which made the universe and kept it going. And so both of these traditions have an understanding of word, and then we become to the beginning of this. And if you have your Bible and want to follow along, or if you check the notes tab, there's a note to this chapter, but we're going to take a look at John chapter 1 and see just how he opens up this story. And this is how it begins. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. So that's brilliant. John is using that imagery that they already know. Both audiences would have read that and said, yes, I am on board with that idea right there. I love how John is using word. But we keep reading, and we're going to get to another place where John uses that word, but he completely redefines their understanding of it. So let's pick up here, verse 6. God sent a man, John the Baptist, to tell about the light so everyone might believe because of his testimony. John himself was not the light. He was simply a witness to tell about the light. The one who is the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He came into the world he created, but the world did not recognize him. He came to his own people, and even they rejected him. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They were reborn, not with a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. And then we get here to verse 14. And I want you to take this in. It said, so the Word became human and made his home among us. Some of the more traditional translations phrase that the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. Now, for the Jewish people, their understanding of a God was a God that was very much interacting with humanity. You see that throughout the entire first part of the Bible. God is talking to people and people are talking back. God is showing up in all kinds of ways, a burning bush and through the prophets. And God is constantly intervening in the human story. But the Greek understanding of God was quite different. To them, God was a distant, far-off concept. Someone who was way out there that was controlling everything, but was hands-off. So this idea that the Word, that order and structure of the world became flesh, became human, and dwelt amongst the people, made his home amongst the people, would have been mind-blowing to them. This was a completely new concept. It would not be crazy to think that this might be the most mind-blowing, redefining verse in the entire Bible for that audience. The idea that the Word became flesh. You know, I love Eugene Peterson. He was a pastor who translated or paraphrased the Bible into what we call the Message. And I always love kind of taking a look at it because it gives us this creative interpretation of different verses. And I love how this verse reads in the Message. It said, God became human and moved into the neighborhood. And I love that because it's a little bit jolting for us that maybe have heard the traditional translation so much that it isn't so mind-blowing or redefining to our ears. See, we've gotten comfortable with the idea that God is with us. If I got up on a Sunday morning at church and said those words, if I got online on a Sunday morning and spoke to you those words, God is with us, I don't think anybody in the audience is going to be shocked. It's not going to blow their mind or redefine anything. We understand the concept that God is with us, but we kind of limit how we understand it. We understand that that's true when we're at a place of worship or in an intimate moment like Christmas or Easter. We understand that's true when we go through times of trouble and there's pain and suffering. We'll often feel the presence of God in that. And so in those moments, to say God is with us, we're like, yeah, I totally understand that. But the idea that God is with us, that God has moved into the neighborhood, is one that we don't often think about. That God is a part of the mundane. God is a part of the everyday. When we drive our kids to school, God is with us. When we show up at the office, God is with us. When we have friends over for a big dinner, God is with us. When we're just sitting and binging Netflix with our spouse, God is with us. But see, that's what John is telling us, is that God and the Word that gave structure and order to everything, that was so powerful, that created and moved and changed, is now living amongst us as a human being. That was that was the story that John was trying to tell them, this redefining of the faith, that God is not far off and distant, but He is a part of every moment of every day in our lives. And I think that is where John 1 becomes a Christmas story. Because isn't that what Christmas is all about? Isn't Christmas about this idea that, well, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word became human and made His home among us. Moved into the neighborhood. See, that's what happened in the manger on Christmas morning. And I've preached about this before, but I'm going to talk about it again because I'm passionate about it. Over the years, we've taken that imagery of the manger and we've decorated it. We've covered it in gold. I did a message a few years ago where I went through the top 10 most expensive nativity scenes that you can buy online. And they get into the thousands of dollars. They use real precious mineral metals, and they have diamonds in them. I mean, they're elaborate, and some of them were beautiful. We love the Christmas decorations. But I think that when we do that, we miss the power of that story. If you look up what it really looked like, it was dirty and it was messy. It was gross. I mean, I don't want to get too graphic here, but any of you who have been present for the birth of a child knows that even in a hospital setting, that moment is a little bit gross. But to imagine that happening in a manger, in a barn, or out back in this dirty, messy kind of place, it's almost hard to comprehend. And I think that's the point of it. In a way, it was God saying that there is no part of the neighborhood that I will not make my home, that I will not dwell. No matter how messy or dirty it is, I will enter into that. And I think that's true in our lives as well. That when we say that God is with us, that the Word is with us, that Jesus is living life alongside of us or in front of us as our shepherd, it's not just in the worship moments or the times of trouble. It's in all the moments. It's in our whole life, even the messy, dirty parts of it. And I think that is the power of the Christmas story. But I want to give us a challenge. If we have that understanding of John 1 and the Word and how God is with us, I want to give us a challenge. Now, have you ever heard of the war on Christmas? It's a phrase that's become popular in different political circles or cultural movements over the last several years. And Christians have a habit, in the United States at least, we like to get upset about things. We like to get mad about things. And I think that's kind of where some of the war on Christmas started. And I know that there are different parts of our society that have started to kind of change Christmas and, well, they take Jesus out of it, which has led to people using the phrase, keep Christ in Christmas. And I understand what people mean when they say that. But I have a challenge for you this morning. I want us to take Christ out of Christmas. I want us to take Jesus out of the manger, out of the nativity, and into the real world that we live in. You know, maybe that's why we like those decorations where Jesus is so pretty and cleaned up. Because we can put them in a box and put them in storage, and then every year around November, pull them back out, put them out, celebrate Jesus, and then put him back in a box. Maybe that's what some of us do with our lives. So for many of us, Christ is only in Christmas. But I think the point that John was making in verse 14 there about the Word becoming human, becoming flesh, is that, well, Christ is not just in Christmas, but he's out of Christmas. He's in every day of the year. So that is my challenge for you as we make our way towards Christmas. Ask, how can we take what we know about Jesus from the Christmas story and continue it on into January and February and March and so on? And I want to wrap up this morning by reading a poem. This is a poem written by someone I follow on Twitter. Reverend Daniel is his name. He's an Anglican priest. He's great. Gets a little sassy. He's funny. He's a great follow. But he wrote this, I guess you could call it a poem here, entitled, "Don't Keep Christ in Christmas." And I'd like to read it this morning. Don't keep Christ in Christmas. Let him out. Let him out of the box of decorations stored in the attic. Let him out of the prayers you only say at midnight mass. Let him out of the carols as background to your shopping. Let him out of the sentimental story cleansed of violence and pain. Let him out of the creche where he remains a helpless infant, where the only woman present is silent and meek, where poverty is romanticized with no threat and no smell, and shepherds are cuddly and everyone is white, and there is no messiness to obscure the miracle. Let him out of December's candle-lit coziness, where his heat melts the wintry ice of our selfishness, where his buds unfold amidst the mud of injustice, and his flowers overtake the borders of manicured gardens, and his harvest fills barns and fruits we never knew existed. Don't keep Christ in Christmas. Let him out. And then when Christmas comes around again, we won't have to keep him in it. For how could he not be in Christmas when he has been here the whole time, keeping us? So, I challenge you this week to invite Jesus into the dirty, messy parts of your life. Let him move into the neighborhood and to be a part of everything that we do. And as we do that, I think that we will follow in the example of so many in the Christmas story, whether it be the shepherds or the wise men, where we won't keep it to ourselves. We will go out and tell that story, the story of Jesus, to others. We'll announce that the Word has become human and is dwelling amongst us, has made his home amongst us. We will tell our neighbors and our friends and our family and our coworkers. We won't be able to keep that to ourselves because that is good news. That is gospel. That is what is at the heart of what John is writing in chapter 1. So let's go. Let's invite Jesus in and then invite others to invite Jesus in. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.